to postpone the original presentation, but we've got Louise here tonight. Louise Harrison is the Natural Areas Coordinator for Save the Sound. She covers the New York section of Save the Sound, and she'll take us on a tour of Plum Island, its waters, describe its unique aspects and the history of its preservation activities, and make the case for the island being conserved. So, Louise, good evening, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I'm so sorry we had to cancel in September because I contracted COVID. It's a common story these days, but I'm
Makes you
fully
different
recovered.
from most people in no way.
So thank you for your patience. And I'm happy to take you on a tour of Plum Island and also discuss the long campaign to preserve Plum Island. So if you're ready, shall I share my screen now?
Absolutely. And everybody else, please mute yourself if you're not muted already. Thank you.
All right, so I'm hoping everybody can see this. I haven't heard anything otherwise, so
we can see it.
okay, great. That's great. Perfect. So again, thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to just point out this artwork before I get going. You'll see some other pen and ink drawings. They're by a up-and-coming artist named Scott Bluedorn, who's in East Hampton, New York. He considers himself an ecological artist, and Save the Sound and the Nature Conservancy were able to use his services for a product we put out a few years ago, which I'll be describing later. But you may be familiar with the concept of a turtle rising out of the ocean to create a land mass, and he used that concept with a seal because Plum Island is known for a very large seal population. So anyway, we love this, and I'll carry on. First, so that you know that what Save the Sound is, we are covering the whole Long Island Sound region, Connecticut and New York, and part of New York City. And we are involved in fighting climate change and land protection, protecting the water of the Sound and the rivers that lead into the Sound. And we do ecological restoration projects. And we have been leading the Preserve Plum Island Coalition since about 2011 or 2012. Now, if this is as close as you've ever been to Plum Island, perhaps you took a ferry from New London over to Long Island. That's the view of Plum Island you would see from that ferry. If this is as close as you've been, I think you're in for a treat, because I will be able to show you some up close and personal shots of the island as we carry on this evening. And this photo from the East Hampton Star is one of my favorites, this oblique angle looking to the east. You can see the harbor that the Plum Island Animal Disease Center boats enter and exit from. Over on the left, where my cursor is the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. Here to the right is a 97-acre freshwater wetland. And this section here is dune land. And all the way out here, there are gun batteries. In the middle here is Fort Terry. And beyond, you'll see Great Gull Island and Little Gull Island, and Fisher's Island in the distance. The people who have been studying Plum Island from biodiversity perspective, who've done the most studies there are the New York Natural Heritage Program. And they've determined that Although there are 25 different ecological communities on this 822-acre island, 5 of them are considered more significant. And this first photo on the left shows maritime dunes and maritime beaches. Why are they significant on Plum Island? Because they're undisturbed and nearly pristine, and that's hard to find these days. The maritime bluffs at Plum Island have been considered significant, and in some places reach 75 feet in height. The marine rocky intertidal shore community is really hard to find these days, and this is the best example of one in the downstate region of New York. There's maybe only one other on Long Island that would even come close to this community, and this one is in great shape. And you probably all know that marine eelgrass meadows are on the decline. As a matter of fact, submerged aquatic vegetation is on the decline worldwide. But there are actually 3 of these meadows at Plum Island. Here's a view of the 97-acre freshwater wetland, which is only just starting to be studied. So very little is known about it. There has not been an inventory of plants and animals here. But when you think about the significance of a large freshwater wetland on an island surrounded by salt water, it begins to explain to you why there is a high diversity of species on Plum Island. As a matter of fact, there are 111 species of conservation concern that have been identified there, endangered and threatened species and rare species, including numerous rare plants. But when you think about the freshwater wetland as supplying fresh water to those animals that can get to Plum Island, you understand its value. Around Plum Island are amazing underwater communities, and Save the Sound was able to sponsor, through generous donors, two series of dives around Plum Island by scientific divers who were contracted by the New York Natural Heritage Program to do an initial survey and then a survey of the communities and as many species as they could identify. And these took place in 2019 and 2021. Here in this photo, underwater photo, you can see to the left colonial sponges and these fern-like animals that are attached. They're sessile, are actually bryozoans. And another red sponge here, you'll see in this lots of bryozoans, and actually the polyps, these white fluffy things, are actually the polyps of northern star coral. People don't often think of coral being in the Northeast, but there it is. And they found that the underwater habitats around Plum Island were matching the diversity of the terrestrial communities at Plum Island. So it was very exciting, and the results are in a report that easily accessed, and you can also watch a webinar about the dives by the divers on YouTube. This is this slide is just a little bit old. I think they found another species of birds at Plum Island. I'm not sure which one it was recently, but I think we're up to 229 bird species. The numbers of birds that are at risk or breeding probably need revision, but we do know there are at least 13 species there that are breeding that are at-risk species. And some you can see here, the northern harrier, American black duck, eider, roseate tern, American oyster catcher, American bittern, piping plover, and common terns. The seals at Plum Island. Oh, the seal populations there in the winter are outstanding. It's one of the largest seal haul-out areas in southern New England, and it is the largest seal haul-out area in New York. haul out areas where the seals haul out onto the rocks to take up some sun, sometimes to actually cool off because they burn a lot of energy swimming around and they have a lot of blubber. So they actually, you might think they're out there to warm up, but in many cases they're there to cool off. And you can see hundreds of them on a winter's day, both harbor seals and gray seals, primarily harbor seals though. And one of the things that we've learned about Plum Island that's so fascinating is that because it's been so protected over the years from people getting on the island in an unauthorized manner, or from people overwhelming the island with visitation, is that species that are shy, like harbor seals, can thrive there. Harbor seals are known to abandon their young if people disturb them, but actually there have been harbor seal pups seen at Plum Island, which is sort of testament to how the lack of human disturbance has really helped these species thrive there. And Plum Island has an amazing and long history, of course, starting with use by the Montaukett Indian Nation that dominated the eastern end of Long Island. We don't know much about their uses in the early days, but of course they were in the region for up to 10,000 years. So there has to have been some occasional use, at least, of Plum Island, and we'd like to know more. Leading up to when this lighthouse was built were a series of different owners after initial colonial occupation. This was built in 1869, following the collapse of an earlier lighthouse that was built in 1824. You may have heard about Plum Gut. That's this body of water to the left here, as being tumultuous and high risk area for navigating a boat. Well, there were 100 shipwrecks here before the federal government would finally listen to the people in Eastern Long Island and bring a lighthouse. So the first lighthouse was 1824. This one's still standing. You can see it needs some help, and it is under some restoration now. Big part of Plum Island's more recent history was the establishment of Fort Terry, which was established in 1897 as the result of fortifications across the mouth of Long Island Sound in response to the advent of the Spanish-American War. And although the Spanish-American War was never realized here in the Northeast, the series of forts continued to be built. And this one, Fort Terry, was right here in the central part of Plum Island. Also on Fisher's Island was Fort Wright. Just to the east on Great Gull Island was Fort Mikey, and there were others. The view you're looking at here is looking to the west. So you're looking across Fort Terry to Plum Gut, and the landmass in the distance is Orient Point, the tip of the North Fork of Long Island. The Animal Disease Center in this case is up here in the upper right. And if you take a look at this assemblage of buildings, which are all that's left of Fort Terry, there had been many more in terms of officers' quarters and dwelling units up and down this road. It does sort of look like a New England village. And that was the concept behind it, was to make it look unassuming and not have it look like a fort, so that ships that would be sailing in would mistake it for a village and not a United States Army location. There are gun batteries in various places on the island that still remain. And the Coast Defense Study Group has determined that Fort Terry is one of the best preserved forts of its era that remain. And they say much of that is because people have not been able to access it, and there's been very little vandalism, and there are a lot of original aspects to it that can be studied. It was used heavily in World War I and World War II as a point of departure and a point of training. This is down inside one of the large gun batteries. And if you look above, you can see there's vegetation. This was sunken down in a hill so that it could not be seen from the waterways. And these gun batteries had retractable guns that would rise up above the top of the hill, shoot, and then retreat down into the pit. So much of Plum Island's history can be seen in this book, which is available from the Southold Historical Society. And I highly recommend it. It's very well researched and fascinating. I'll give you the name of it again later if you care to have it. Now, this is what most people have heard about when it comes to Plum Island, the famous Plum Island Animal Disease Center, where research on foot and mouth disease and African swine fever has had worldwide importance. As a matter of fact, this is the place where the only vaccine for foot and mouth disease was developed. Research was done here and the vaccine was developed here. And even today, veterinarians will arrive from all around the world to pick up vials of the latest vaccine. Of course, they have to keep making it according to how the pathogen mutates. So there's always more work to be done, and they have veterinarians from around the world coming to get vials of the vaccine and learn how to use it and learn about the disease. Unfortunately, foot and mouth disease is extant in some parts of the world, although there have been no cases of it escaping here for a very, very long time, or anywhere in the United States. But should it escape, it would be devastating to our economy, because this is a disease that can travel through the air just by an animal breathing, and it can travel a long distance. So there is a concern that if there were a sick animal outdoors here on Plum Island, that it could even infect animals in Connecticut just by the air passage over Long Island Sound. You'll see these pipes at the top of the building. All of those are filters. So the building operates on negative pressure. It pulls clean air in from the outside, and every bit of air in the building goes out through these filters, so nothing can escape. Most of this building is large animal holding areas. The laboratory areas are actually smaller, and this building to the right is the administration building, and that seems to have the best possible future for reuse. The rest of the building was really used for its purpose, and the government decided, and Congress decided to move the whole operation to Manhattan, Kansas, along with Department of Homeland Security and USDA deciding to move it to Manhattan, Kansas, where their National Agro and Biodefense Facility is going to be built. But what Congress's part of this was they decided to sell Plum Island to pay for the new lab in Manhattan, Kansas. They had some idea that it could bring a lot of money and pay for the new lab. Well, that didn't actually happen because the new lab needed extra fortifications when they realized it lay in Tornado Alley and really needed to be built to withstand the impacts of tornadoes. So Congress had to appropriate all the money it needed for the Manhattan, Kansas facility, and it became unnecessary to sell Plum Island for that purpose. Nonetheless, it stayed on the auction block. And this was of great concern to environmentalists around the region and historians, and people became quite upset. So in around 2010, 2011, people started to get organized. This is another view of the island and looking back toward Orient Point. Kind of looks like a question mark. The the first people to act on this were the government people at the town of Southold. They knew that there was little they could do to change the minds of a federal agency that had owned the island that lay within their town for over 100 years. But they knew that they had control over zoning. And so with the idea that perhaps Plum Island would be sold to an individual or private party, they decided they'd better put some zoning on the island right away. And they did a study, very comprehensive study of the assets of Plum Island, and gave great consideration to how it ought to be zoned. And they came up with two brand new innovative zoning districts, the Plum Island Research District and the Plum Island Conservation District. Now, if you've never heard of districts like this before, I don't think there are any. I don't know of any other towns that were quite so bold in their zoning as to call something a research district or a conservation district, at least not too many in this region, but that's what they did. And they knew that the moment that Plum Island might fall into private hands, this zoning would be in place. And having it in place ahead of time would sort of be a shot across the bow and let developers know that Plum Island was not going to be developed for housing or residences or high rises or hotels or a golf course. Like there was at least one person who wanted to do that, who rose to a very high level in our government and was a developer in his past life. But then other people got involved and the Preserve Plum Island Coalition started to form. And at first it was a handful of organizations, and we are now up to about 122 organizations that comprise the Preserve Plum Island Coalition. The Minunkatuk Audubon Society is invited to join. All you need to do is agree with our mission statement, which you can read at preserveplumisland.org. And if you go to the partners page or the membership page, you can see who the other organizations are. We also have the Montauk Indian Nation involved. They've been advocating alongside us and recently joined our steering committee. So over the years, with our advocacy and reaching out to different government entities, we started to see that, the state of New York would write a letter to Senator Schumer saying that they wish that Plum Island would be taken off the auction block. The East End Supervisors and Mayors Association decided that they should write a letter to Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand and the Congressman Zeldin. The town of Brookhaven supervisor wrote a letter. There were a series of letters that Plum Island should be taken off the auction block, imploring Congress to undo the act of putting it on the auction block in the first place. New York State decided to put Plum Island in its open space conservation plan and said that they would acquire it if it did not become a refuge. I'm sorry that the top of the cartoon bubble is cut off. At least it is on my screen, but it says, "What do you see instead? Show us." We went to Washington and we showed them the zoning map. And we said, look, Plum Island could be for conservation and research. There could be a reuse of the laboratory. We could have all sorts of conservation programs on the eastern portion of the island. And basically, the committees that we met with, the congressmen and the senators, said, well, the zoning is very nice and very interesting, but it's not a plan. You really need to show us what you have in mind for Plum Island in the future. Tell us what it is you want to see done there. And so Save the Sound and the Nature Conservancy got together and we hired a consulting firm called Marstel Day, who has a lot of expertise in moving federal properties into conservation. And we took some funding from our donors, and we developed a program called Envision Plum Island, where we had a series of 3 formal workshops from 2018 to 2019, many smaller meetings with officials and experts. And we began to explore what Plum Island could be used for in the future, how it could be done, and what really was what made the most sense. In this particular meeting at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, we met with 60 scientists, naturalists, and educators. And in a whirlwind session, came up with lots of great ideas for how Plum Island should be preserved and some specifics to deal with conflicts of use. You may recognize this gentleman here, the famous Carl Safina, author of many books on ecology and a scholar and a prize-winning author. We came up with a vision concept called Plum Island Preserve, and we overlaid it on the habitat map that the New York Natural Heritage Program had produced in one of their earlier reports, where they had found the 25 different ecological communities. And if it looks a little similar to the zoning map, it's because we did base it on that, but we added a couple of more divisions to it. For instance, actually 3 more divisions. So over here on the left, we decided that around the lighthouse, there really should be its own area for visitation, because some people just love lighthouses, and maybe it even could be a bed and breakfast. This area to the southernmost part of the island and the easternmost part of the island were considered to be the most delicate. And we felt that in terms of ecology, and we felt that they could be visited, but perhaps with a guide, and perhaps very infrequently. Perhaps professors or other researchers could visit with their students on a permitted basis and do field research in ecology, archaeology, things like that. And then the middle portion we considered to be the most durable. That's where Fort Terry is and the big parade grounds. And that's where it's seen a lot of use over the years anyway. And has some areas with invasive species that need management. It seemed like the kind of place where people would want to come for a day anyway, and perhaps visit and look out over the seals, which are here on the south shore. Then the last was the research district as defined by the town of Southold. And we tried to find some new uses for that area. Further, it was the ferry terminal at the Orient Point end, and that's depicted in this picture in the upper left corner. It's 9.5 acres with a 2.5 acre deep water port. And we were a little concerned about it because it was zoned for heavy use, if should it ever go into private hands. That was a place where there could have been a hotel or restaurants or condominiums. And we worked over time with the town to have that rezoned for traveling just to and from Plum Island. That was a real success of ours. So through all the work we did in Envision Plum Island, we were able to come up with 2 documents that you can get from our website at the website address here at the top. The 72-page full report has all the details explaining our rationale, what we found about Plum Island, or what the rationale is for our various suggestions. The pictorial brochure, which is this one on the left, has actually been updated because we've had to make some revisions based on some circumstances that I'll be describing to you that happened since 2020 when this report first came out. But the pictorial brochure is really short. You turn the pages and you get the full idea of what it is that we were hoping for Plum Island, just based on looking at the pictures. And we do believe that Plum Island can be a preserve. It would preserve ecological value, history, cultural heritage, and could provide ecologically sustainable access and education to the public. Here's one of Scott Bluedorn's other drawings, composite idea of Plum Island. Again, this ferry dock, a closer view of it. The town of Southold did rezone it in September of 2020, came up with a new category for it called Marine 3. It's dedicated to ferry travel to and from Plum Island. And this administration building over here on the left, where it says potential museum, that could easily be turned into a small visitors center or a small museum or a place for evening lectures. We're very glad to see that the town agreed that this needed to be preserved, at least through zoning. It is part of what the government wanted to sell. Well, so we had our plan and we had our ideas, and we'd spoken to nearly 200 people throughout the region, both states, all around Long Island Sound. We spoke to people in professional research positions, like people at Stony Brook University and Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories. We spoke to New York State government agencies about the future of potentially New York taking Plum Island. We envisioned how it could be managed for its ecological value and for interpretation of its history and cultural heritage, but we still had this problem. Plum Island was still for sale. We needed to repeal the problem legislation. And fortunately, we were able to do that in December of 2020 because of the pressure from the region through the Preserve Plum Island Coalition. Our champions in Congress heard us and made sure that Plum Island would never be for sale again. We're eternally grateful for this. This did not put Plum Island into a conservation status, but it did get it off the auction block. And if you're not familiar with these faces, I'll just quickly let you know that Senate Leader Chuck Schumer up in the upper left, Kirsten Gillibrand is the other senator for New York, Richard Blumenthal, senior senator in Connecticut, Chris Murphy, the other senator from Connecticut. And you have Representatives Joe Courtney and Rosa DeLauro in the House, all helping, and numerous others did too, but you can thank these leaders for getting it off the auction block. You know, I'm so sorry about this upper banner. It's blocking some of the words on my slides, but I just wanted to, I can let you know what it says. You can or cannot?
Can.
Oh, okay, so I have an upper banner on mine that's annoying, but I'm glad you can read it. So we do know now that the Department of Homeland Security is decommissioning the Plum Island Animal Disease Center and preparing for its departure to the National Bio and Agro Defense Facility in Manhattan, Kansas. And that was planned all along. But now that Plum Island is not going to be auctioned or put up for a public sale, the GSA, which is the General Services Administration, has to find a new owner for Plum Island. And they will have to go through a process that the government has laid out in law that says they need to offer it to other federal agencies first. As soon as a report of excess is delivered by the Department of Homeland Security. A partial report of excess was issued last year. As soon as the full report is done, the GSA needs to begin a very rapid process, actually. Agencies will have about 30 days to decide whether or not they're interested in Plum Island. They don't have to say we'll take it, but they have to kind of show interest for the clock to stop. Because if no federal agency shows interest, Plum Island will be offered to New York State. And if New York State isn't ready to show interest or doesn't want it, it'll be offered to the county that Plum Island is in, which is Suffolk County, New York, or the town of Southold after that. And when they've run out of municipalities, they will offer it to not-for-profits. And nobody seems interested in managing this entire island. Very challenging, and it would be quite a bit for any particular nonprofit to take on. So at that point, it would be put back on the auction block, and this would be a terrible outcome. So we decided we needed to start talking to the federal agencies really quickly and see if we could find a federal agency that would show interest in our vision for Plum Island. And we thought the Department of Interior would be the appropriate place. At least that agency has the Fish and Wildlife Service in it and the National Park Service in it. So we did begin in December of 2021 talking to these agencies, as well as to the Council on Environmental Quality, which is in the White House. And we have developed a concept throughout this past year of 2022 that a national monument would be a good outcome. We've learned together that a national monument proclaimed by a president can be anything the proclamation says it can be. In other words, it's flexible, and it doesn't predict or dictate which agency would necessarily have to own the island, but it could even be a combination of agencies. The proclamation would set out what the goals are and the management objectives. And we're seeking a national monument for Plum Island that would be for the purposes of ecological conservation, historical preservation, and the discovery and the celebration of our shared cultural heritage. And we see that the management objectives would follow from those three primary themes. One of the things that came out of the Envision Plum Island report was a strong recommendation that a friends group be established. And this was done in the middle of 2021. Friends of Plum Island was established. So now it is a 501c3 that can accept donations in the future when Plum Island is preserved that could go towards stewardship. And we have identified a donor that seems very willing to begin an enormous endowment for Plum Island. And we're hoping that this will happen. She was looking for a place to put her money already a year ago, but this process of preserving Plum Island is still underway. But we hope she'll still be with us because she has tens of millions that she's willing to put towards Plum Island preservation. We know that the Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York State Parks could also be helpful in managing Plum Island. Right across from Plum Island, across Plum Gut in Orient Point, is Orient Beach State Park. And so it's really just a mile and a half away, obviously by boat, but it lends itself to some kind of co-management. So we're hoping too that under a national monument kind of a construct, the state can also be involved, and that there are models for that. So now we're talking to these three people. Upper left is Brenda Mallory. She's the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and that's a cabinet position. She's also the person who's overseeing the America the Beautiful campaign in the present administration and working closely with Deb Haaland, the person in the middle, who is our Secretary of Interior. And you've probably seen pictures of New York's governor, Kathy Hochul. So this could be an important partnership, and we've in conversation with all of them. We actually had a letter come in from two of the commissioners under Governor Hochul, Commissioner of Parks and Commissioner of the DEC, that was sent to Secretary Haaland last January, offering partnership capabilities. And the senior senator from Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, wrote a letter just last August directly to the president asking for a national monument. And he was one of 4 signatories of the 4 senators on a letter that went out the previous April to the White House, again, asking for a national monument. Now, this is something you can do too, and we can make it very easy. We have made it easy. You can take out your phone and type in 52886 and text in STS with a space Plum, capital P. So it has to look exactly like this. And you will get a letter on your phone that you can sign and send directly to the White House, just like that. If you don't want to use your phone right now, which I understand, you can go to preserveplumisland.org. And as soon as you get there, you'll see a big red button at the top of the page. You can click that. And again, you'll get a letter that you can send to the president. And that, in either case, you can modify the letter to your liking. So you don't have to just send a form letter, but you can use it to construct your own if you like. We really urge you to write to the president. You can always take out pen and paper and do it by hand or put it out on your laptop. Here's the address in the lower left. It's Washington, D.C. 20500. And you would start your letter, Dear Mr. President. Those are the kinds of letters that really do get read. We suppose they all do, but I'm pretty sure that if an envelope arrives at the executive building for the White House, they all get opened. And I think they all get responses. Now, we had some real recent success from all of our lobbying and efforts last year. You've been hearing about how hard it was for Congress to pass a budget, and the budget was supposed to have been signed at the end of September. But they had a continuing resolution and then another continuing resolution, and we were wringing our hands and wondering what we could get for Plum Island in all the time that passed. But again, our champions in the Senate really pulled through for us. And when the thing was said and done at the end of December, we got a lot of support for Plum Island. Not actual dollars, but we got statements in the explanatory statements for the budget in the sections on Homeland Security, Financial Services and General Government, and the Department of Interior budgets that urged the agencies to be considering conservation for Plum Island, asking them to please coordinate with one another and teach each other some of the ins and outs of Plum Island. For instance, the Interior Department wanted to know how much money does it cost to run Plum Island from year to year. That wasn't something the Preserve Plum Island Coalition could answer, but the Department of Homeland Security can. There were some questions about cleaning up waste on Plum Island, legacy waste from past practices. And people are a little concerned that maybe after Department of Homeland Security cleans up the place, that someday in the future, there'll be some contaminant that is discovered that no one ever knew was a contaminant. Just like we're hearing nowadays on PFOA and PFAS, elements of, nonstick frying pans and things that we're now learning are dangerous for us that people didn't know were dangerous for us in the past. So the Department of Interior is saying, well, we're concerned who's going to be holding the bag on that? Who's going to pay for that cleanup if we have to discover something in the future that is bad? Well, again, we can't answer that. Your Audubon Society can't answer that, but let's get some assurance from Homeland Security. So there was language in all of these bills that ended up in the one omnibus resolution that is basically saying, come on, agencies, talk to each other, resolve these questions, find out if you're willing to manage some additional funds that may come down the pike for some interim ecological management. That's something we've been talking about during the past year, is getting, as the proverbial boots on the ground, get some biologists and ecologists over to Plum Island now, while the Homeland Security people are still there, while they're decommissioning the lab and the facility, and let people assess the condition of the ecological communities, see what needs to be done in the short term, and begin making some long-term ecological management plans. So we were very grateful that this language was in this budget. It's a real step forward. It may sound like a bureaucratic chit chat, but it's exactly what we needed to have done to move the ball forward on preserving Plum Island. So we are extremely grateful for their actions. And we do believe that Plum Island can be preserved. We believe our vision is feasible and that it has broad support. We're getting together this year, as we do every month. This year, we're developing a federal strategy where we're going to start to try to put together some management objectives we can offer up to the Department of Interior as suggestions, because if they find that one of their agencies is willing to take Plum Island, and if the White House is willing to make Plum Island a national monument, we'd like to give them a head start, because we've been studying Plum Island, even though we can't get there all the time. We've learned quite a bit about it, and we'd like to offer suggestions on management. So we hope they'll accept those and allow us to bring in our broad coalition into further outreach efforts and coordination with the agencies if we can bring Plum Island into conservation. I'm sorry. Another view of our wetland. This is a great resource for any questions, but I'm happy to answer them, of course, but you'll find lots of resources at preserveplumisland.org. I can also send out some paper copies of the brochure if you're interested. We offer you, again, the membership. All you need to do is agree with the mission statement and give me some information, and we will put your Audubon Society up on this website as a member, and you will be kept informed of what we're up to and help us make decisions when we need to go out to the greater coalition for decision making. You can always contact me. Here's my email and my phone number. Happy to talk to any of you at any time. And I want to thank you for your time and your patience listening to me tonight. And I want to acknowledge the people and the below here who helped to fund our Envision Plum Island process, which moved this conservation effort forward to such a large degree. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Hoping for.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, let's see.
You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself or enter it in the chat. So besides the letter to the president, is there anything else that people can do now?
I think, that I'm glad you asked, but first of all, I think we should all be supporting our environmental organizations like the Minunkatuk Audubon Society, who wants to get information out and does such a good job of informing its membership. You can also make a donation to Save the Sound, and you can specify that it would go to the Plum Island effort if you like. That's something concrete you can do if you would like. A letter to the president is important. I think that what you could do right away is a thank you letter to the 4 senators or to your senators in Connecticut, and thank them for working so hard on getting language into the budget. You can know that their staff are still working on this. They're not done just because they got some language into the budget. They are actually planning on going to Plum Island in the very near future and talking to Homeland Security people there and making some assessments themselves and thinking about what can be done. So thanking them for their continued effort, I think, is another thing you can do.
Okay.
They're all
If
very
you have ideas,
approachable.
love to hear them too.
They're all very approachable.
They are. We're fortunate.
Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. One question from Sue is, can we visit?
Oh, good question. So up until 2018, the Department of Homeland Security was offering tours to groups. So a group like yours could have made a reservation, and after security clearances, you could have brought over anywhere, up to 28 or 30 people.
We did.
But they stopped. Did you?
Yes.
Oh,
It was
so you
really
know that.
creepy too. It was really creepy with all the security stuff.
But it wasn't once you got there, was it?
No, we were followed around the whole time.
Yeah, well, understood.
Yeah.
I've been to Plum Island 3 times and I found it exhilarating. And I thought to me, I felt changed. It's an amazing place and beautiful, and just gives you plenty of ideas for the future. Right now, there are no more tours. I think the reason is that they're going through a lot of construction and deconstruction while they're decommissioning the place. They haven't really given us a reason why they stopped the tours. But of course, our hope is for public access in a sustainable and manageable way if Plum Island is conserved.
Louise, a question concerning the legislation and the reports behind the legislation. Would it be possible to get some references of in the legislation that people could go to actually see what is in there?
Yes, and I can send the links to Dennis, and perhaps Dennis, can you distribute them?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yep.
I will do that I'll do that when we're done this evening. You can go right into the documents and see some of the language.
That's helpful in discussing things with the senators and congressmen.
Yes. And if you don't feel like you want to do that, you can basically thank them for supporting Plum Island in 2020 by repealing the sale at public auction. And you can thank them for the measures that they put into this last omnibus budget. And that would even be enough. The thank you is the biggest part of the message, and thanking them for their continued efforts, which are going forward even into this year. They all seem dedicated to preserving Plum Island, but certainly if you want to be more detailed, you'll have that information.
Another question, is it possible that Plum Island could become a national park instead of a monument?
there are a lot of possibilities. We believe that we should leave it up to the Department of Interior to decide which agency would hold the island. Under any circumstances, if it stays in federal hand, it's owned by the federal government, but one or another agency is going to end up holding it. It'll be transferred into their holdings. It can be held by the National Park Service and be a national monument or a national park. It can be held by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and be a national monument. It could be held by more than one agency. So the idea that we liked about a national monument was the flexibility it afforded and the fact it would not have to go through Congress to be declared. A president can create a national monument through the Antiquities Act. To create a national park or a wildlife refuge, Congress would have to be involved, and that could be very cumbersome and might take a very long time. The downside of a national monument designation is that it has been challenged in the past. The administration prior to the Biden administration tried to undo national monuments that were declared by President Obama. And this administration restored them, and there's some issues that are still in the courts. The prevailing belief is that the Antiquities Act allows a president to make a national monument, but there's nothing in law that says a president can undo a national monument. Nonetheless, there is this feeling that there's potential for a national monument to be changed in some way by a subsequent administration. So one of the things we've been talking about with our senators is there a way, something they could do that would bolster a national monument declaration by the administration? In other words, if they appropriated money for it, does that give sufficient recognition to the national monument that it would prove that two branches of government recognize it and somehow codify it both? Or could there be legislation itself that would say it would create a national monument? And yes, there has been in the past, there have been occasions when Congress has actually created a national monument. But again, then you have to go through Congress, and Congress is rancorous, to say the least, at this point. Yeah. So the White House looks like a good option. The Wilderness Society, which is a national organization, has helped make numerous national monuments across the United States, and they feel that this Plum Island is well poised for this. They are helping to promote it at the White House. They've supported it in their publications, and they have also helped get an article into the Washington Post in a newsletter they put out called Climate 202, which lists Plum Island as one of the top 3 or 4 places that could be created as a national monument by President Biden. So it's out there. The White House is aware that people are asking for a national monument. We've generated 1,700 letters just from Save the Sound supporters, but our other organizations in the coalition also have gotten letters written. So they have been flooded, and your letters can help with that effort too. I'm very hopeful. I think something can happen with this. And but yes, can it be a national park? Yes, it can. It's just it was a longer road to getting there.
And there's another question. How much visiting do you expect possible in the future?
Thank you for asking that. This is a question that we spent a lot of time on in our Envision Plum Island sessions. We recognize that Plum Island is a delicate place, and that's why we, on the map I showed you earlier, we're hoping that certain areas would be pretty much off limits to foot traffic, unless it was with a docent, a guide, or under a special permit. But we also recognize that with visitation at some level will come appreciation and better stewardship. Plum Island is not the kind of place you can just leave alone. There's a lot of perimeter and a lot of people out in boats who'd love to pull up on the shores and camp there, or start a fire, or have a picnic and leave their litter behind, or sneak off into the woods. We can't let that happen. We need to have security. We need to have some limits on visitation, but we also know that all of that will have to follow management objectives. So that's our next step, is to combine our thoughts with more experts and come up with some specific management objectives for the island, and visitation would have to conform to the best practices for those management objectives. Under any circumstances, we see it as limited. It would, whether it's scheduled, whether it's by permit, whether it's by lottery, whether it's by some kind of tickets, we don't know how that would go, but we would like to participate in the thinking on that. But we all also have recognized that it should be equitable. It shouldn't just be the people who can afford an expensive ferry ticket who can get there. We want to find a way for everybody to be able to enjoy it in a sustainable way. So it may just be, 1 day a week, or just a limited number of people per trip, something like that.
Another question just came in. How would you feel about virtual tours?
Perfect. And that's the sort of thing that an overnight visitor in the lighthouse could enjoy. A visitor at the Plum Island ferry dock at Orient Point could enjoy, or anybody could enjoy in a presentation like we're doing tonight. This is a drone photograph. We can have more flights like this that can give an idea of what's there. So that's a great idea as well. As a matter of fact, one of the thoughts I had for programs, if they were held at Orient Point, would be to talk about all the islands in this archipelago. That, jumping from Plum Island to Great Gull Island to Little Gull Island to Fisher's Island and out to Napatree Point in Rhode Island. It's a fantastic archipelago with geologic features that are interesting to learn about, amazing ecological connections between them all, not just the fish that swim around them and the underwater communities, but the bird life. For instance, right next door is Great Gull Island, which has the largest common tern colony in the entire world and the largest roseate tern colony in the Western Hemisphere. It's owned by the American Museum of Natural History. Those birds fly around Plum Island and forage. The seals that are at Little Gull Island, primarily gray seals, are now starting to move over and occupy places on Plum Island and have pups. So there's a lot of interplay between the islands, and I would love to see a visitor center at Orient Point where you can walk there right from the Cross Sound Ferry dock, have visitors from New England and New York City and elsewhere learn about the archipelago, learn about all the species, and understand the interplay and how delicate these islands are and how important they are.
I see we need a director of education.
Any other questions?
Well, you can always write to me at lharrison@savethesound.org if you have a question later. I will send Dennis the links to the pieces of legislation we discussed earlier, as soon as I sign off. And I really just want to thank you for letting me join you tonight.